according to a source close to the investigation, there was no sign of an assault inside the house. I mean, we know there was blood on the outside, but inside, and that the house was clean. Some of the rooms were immaculate, but there were no visible signs inside. What does that mean to you?
Well, I had heard that information early on from some of the deputies that had responded, that there didn't appear to be, the house wasn't in shambles. Again, I think what that says to me is these individuals felt comfortable being there. They were there for one thing and one thing only, it appears, and that was to take Nancy.
2:28 a.m. in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson. A quiet residential neighborhood where most homes were dark, still, and locked in the kind of silence that follows midnight. Inside one of those homes, an 84-year-old woman had last been confirmed alive just a few hours earlier. But by this moment, something in the timeline had already broken. A monitoring system tied to her medical device failed to send its expected signal. At the same time, outside her residence, a doorbell camera that had been active throughout the evening suddenly stopped transmitting. It did not glitch. It did not fade slowly. It simply went offline. And within minutes, the pattern of a normal night turned into something investigators would later struggle to align. Earlier that same evening, at approximately 9:50 p.m. on January 31, 2026, Nancy Guthrie had been dropped off at her home. The person who brought her there was her son-in-law, Tommaso Cayan. That moment was documented as the final confirmed time she was seen alive by someone known to her. After that drop-off, there were no confirmed interactions. No verified phone calls. No witnesses placing her outside the residence again. Just a house, a familiar routine, and a narrow window of time that would soon become the center of a widening investigation. Between 9:50 p.m. and the early hours of February 1st, a gap formed. Roughly 4 hours.
How would you describe the mood in Tucson right now? I mean, are people frustrated? Are they surprised it's still gone? Are people moved on?
I think it's a mixture of all of them, right? I think some people have moved on. Some people are like, oh my God, thank you. You know, there's thousands of other missing people, and, you know, they need, you know, media too. I think a lot of people were really disheartened when you and, you know, the other media entities left, because it's not, when you're not doing things here, you're not drawing publicity to the case, which is important for something like this.
Enough time for movement, for decisions, for actions that would later be reconstructed second by investigators trying to understand what happened inside that window. At 1:47 a.m., a figure approached the front of Nancy Guthrie's home. The doorbell camera captured motion. Then, the device stopped functioning after being physically removed from its position. That detail alone shifted the direction of the case. It was no longer just about disappearance. It became about control of visibility, control of information, and timing that did not appear random. Inside the home, nothing had been publicly confirmed about disturbance or struggle in the immediate aftermath. But investigators treated the sequence of events outside the house as significant enough to re-evaluate the entire timeline from the moment Nancy was dropped off. By 2:28 a.m., the medical monitoring signal tied to her pacemaker stopped transmitting data. That interruption marked another critical point in the sequence. Not because it provided answers, but because it narrowed the timeline even further. 2 signals. 2 interruptions. One window of time that now carried more weight than anything else in the case. As news of the disappearance spread, the situation began to move beyond a single residence. Law enforcement activity expanded across multiple locations in the Catalina foothills area. Investigators were not focused on just one home anymore. They were working across several addresses linked through family and personal connections. Among those locations was a property connected to Tommaso Cayan, the same individual who had last been with Nancy earlier that evening. At the same time, journalist Brian Entin was on the ground reporting visible law enforcement activity.
When you go into a house as an investigator and it looks clean, I mean, you know someone's missing, but there's not, you know, an area that's obvious, like, oh, something went down right here, there's a pool of blood, or oh, there's all sorts of stuff thrown on the ground here. If it just looks clean, what do you do?
Well, you do a very good canvas of the scene. You're going to protect everything that you can. You're going to have the forensic investigators come out, our photographers, and they're going to photograph, they're going to fingerprint, they're going to swab for DNA.
He documented officers moving between properties, observing searches, and noting items being removed for further review. His reporting focused on what could be seen in real time, not what was being summarized later in official statements. The presence of coordinated investigative work across multiple homes signaled a shift in scale. This was no longer being treated as a routine missing person case. It was expanding. And with that expansion came more questions than answers. What investigators had not publicly clarified was why multiple locations were being examined at once, or how each site connected to the central timeline that began at 9:50 p.m. and fractured just hours later. Every new detail added weight to the same unresolved question. What happened inside that 4-hour window after Nancy Guthrie was last seen being dropped off at her home? At this stage of the investigation, no official conclusion had been made public. No confirmed suspect had been formally named in release statements. And no final explanation had been provided for the interruptions in the timeline that defined those early morning hours. But what was clear was that investigators were no longer looking at the case as isolated events. They were mapping connections between time, movement, and access. And as that process continued, attention began to shift toward the people closest to Nancy's final known moments, including those who had been physically present with her shortly before everything went quiet. The investigation was still developing. Evidence was still being reviewed. And key details remained under analysis. But one fact had already anchored the entire case. Nancy Guthrie was last seen alive at 9:50 p.m. After that, the timeline did not stay intact. It broke apart in the dark hours that followed. And what happened inside that break is still what investigators are working to understand. At this point, one question continues to stand at the center of everything. What really happened between the moment she walked into her home and the moment every signal stopped responding? If you are watching this and following the case, share your thoughts in the comments below. One detail in this timeline stands out to you more than the rest, and your perspective matters as this investigation continues to unfold. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update in this case.
So just because, the house isn't in shambles or, there's evidence of an assault or something like that, doesn't mean that they're just going to bypass the house. They're still going to fingerprint it, DNA swab it, photograph it.
Does it make it harder?
In one aspect, yes, because you don't know if there was an assault that occurred because nothing got disturbed. But I think in the grand scheme of things, the biggest thing that matters is the blood spatter at the front of the door.
Inside the early hours of February 1st, 2026, before public awareness fully caught up to the timeline, investigators were already revisiting the final hours of Nancy Guthrie's known movements. The focus had shifted from a single residence to the sequence of events leading up to it. At approximately 9:50 p.m. on January 31st, Nancy had been dropped off at her home in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson. That detail remained unchanged. It was the last confirmed moment she was seen alive by someone who had direct interaction with her. The individual who dropped her off was her son-in-law, Tommaso Caio. That fact became a central reference point in the early stages of the investigation, not as an accusation, but as part of establishing the final known timeline. After that moment, there was no verified communication confirming her safety. No confirmed sightings outside the residence. Only silence within a tightly defined window of hours. This was the point investigators began reconstructing not just movement, but context. Nancy Guthrie was described in records and family accounts as an elderly woman with strong ties to her family. Her daily life was centered around familiar routines, contact with relatives, and remaining independent within her home environment. Those close to her described her as consistent in her habits, someone who maintained predictable patterns that made any deviation more noticeable. That consistency is what made the timeline shift so significant. Because nothing in the early hours suggested normal activity after she entered her home. Instead, the data points began to separate. A camera signal that stopped transmitting at 1:47 a.m. a medical monitoring system that failed to send its expected update at 2:28 a.m. and a residence that, from that point forward, produced no confirmed outward communication. Investigators began placing emphasis on what was known rather than what was assumed. The last physical handover of presence. The last confirmed interaction. The last point at which multiple independent details aligned. From there, attention moved toward relationships connected to the victim's immediate environment. Among those connections was the family structure surrounding Nancy Guthrie. Within that structure, investigators noted that Tommaso Kyan was not only the last person to see her alive, but also part of the same household network through marriage ties to her daughter, Annie Guthrie. This relationship placed him within close proximity to both the victim and the residents, not as an outsider, but as someone with established familiarity. However, at this stage of the investigation, no public determination had been made regarding involvement or responsibility. His role remained defined strictly by timeline presence and familial connection. At the same time, media coverage began to intensify. Journalist Brian Entin was reporting from the field, documenting visible law enforcement movement across multiple properties connected to the broader case. His reports described officers entering and exiting locations, coordinating across different addresses, and removing items for further review. The presence of simultaneous investigative activity across multiple homes raised questions about the scale of the inquiry. It indicated that authorities were not limiting their focus to a single location, but instead evaluating a network of connections tied to the victim's final days. As this expanded, the public narrative began to form around a central tension. What changed between the moment Nancy Guthrie was dropped off at her home and the early morning hours when her signals stopped responding? Investigators did not publicly assign a conclusion to that question. Instead, they continued building timelines, cross-checking data, and reviewing physical and digital evidence sources. In parallel, the emotional weight of the case grew within the family. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance triggered urgent responses from relatives who began seeking answers through public appeals and private coordination with authorities. The uncertainty surrounding her whereabouts created a widening gap between known facts and unresolved outcomes. Within that gap, speculation increased online and in public discussion, but official channels maintained a measured stance, emphasizing that the investigation was ongoing and that conclusions would depend on verified evidence. Despite that caution, one element remained constant throughout early reporting. The timeline did not extend beyond the early morning hours of February 1st. Everything after that point became a matter of interpretation rather than confirmation. At this stage, investigators continued focusing on reconstructing movements, reviewing surveillance coverage where available, and analyzing communication records tied to relevant individuals in the hours surrounding the disappearance. The case had moved beyond a missing person report in structure. It had become a coordinated review of time, access, and sequence. But even with expanding resources and multiple agencies involved, one central gap remained unresolved. There was still no publicly confirmed explanation for what occurred inside the critical window between the final known drop-off and the interruption of all signals. And that gap became the foundation for every theory, every report, and every unanswered question that followed. Because once the timeline broke, everything after it depended on evidence that had not yet been fully disclosed. And what investigators would find next would shift attention far beyond a single residence.
That there were no signs of an assault inside Nancy's house. No signs of an assault. The house was mostly clean, and the way it was described to me is that some rooms were actually immaculate. But the headline is that there were no signs of an assault inside. Remember, obviously there was blood that was seen on the front sort of steps area, front area right in front of her front door. That's where we saw the blood.
But at this point in the case, one question continued to sit at the center of all activity. What exactly happened inside that 4-hour window after Nancy Guthrie entered her home? The answer to that question had not yet been reached. And what followed next would bring the investigation into a wider and more complex stage that no one involved could ignore. By the time daylight returned over Tucson, the investigation had expanded beyond a single residence into multiple coordinated locations across the Catalina foothills area. law enforcement presence was no longer contained to one address. Instead, officers were seen moving between several properties linked through family and personal connections to Nancy Guthrie. Among these locations was the home directly associated with Tommaso Cian, the individual who had last been with Nancy before she returned to her residence on the night of January 31st. At the same time, journalist Brian Entin was documenting visible law enforcement activity on the ground. His reporting focused on movement patterns, timing of searches, and the coordinated nature of investigative teams operating across multiple sites. Items were observed being removed from one of the properties under review. Officials did not publicly detail the nature of those items, and no immediate conclusions were released regarding their significance. What stood out in early reporting was not a single piece of evidence, but the scope of the operation. Multiple homes. Multiple teams. Simultaneous activity. This suggested that investigators were no longer treating the case as isolated to the victim's residence alone. Instead, they were examining a broader network of locations tied to the final timeline. As this expanded, attention increasingly returned to the sequence of events on the night of January 31st. The drop-off at 9:50 p.m. The absence of confirmed activity afterward. The interruption of external signals during the early morning hours. Each detail became part of a reconstructed timeline being built across agencies. Within this structure, Tommaso Cian remained defined in official context as the last known person to have seen Nancy Guthrie alive. That fact placed him within the critical window of investigation, not as a declared suspect in public record, but as a key timeline reference point. Investigators continued examining communication data, movement records, and surveillance coverage from surrounding areas. At the same time, Brian Entin's field reporting provided visual confirmation that law enforcement activity was not limited to procedural review. The presence of coordinated searches indicated active investigative direction rather than passive observation. However, authorities did not release full explanations of their strategy or findings at that stage. This created a gap between visible activity and official statements. In that gap, public attention intensified. Questions centered on why multiple properties were being examined simultaneously, and how each location connected to the broader timeline of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Despite growing speculation, investigators maintained that the case was still active and that evidence was being processed through appropriate channels. As the investigation progressed, one point became increasingly central. The timeline itself was becoming the primary structure guiding all inquiry. Every location, every person, and every piece of data was being measured against that narrow window between the final confirmed sighting and the loss of external signals. That structure defined the direction of the case moving forward. And as more information was gathered, it became clear that the investigation was entering a phase where digital records, physical evidence, and behavioral analysis would begin intersecting. But at this stage, no final determination had been made public. And the case remained open, with key details still under review. What investigators uncovered next would move the focus beyond physical locations and into patterns that extended far before the night of the disappearance. As the investigation progressed, attention began shifting toward data sources that extended beyond physical evidence. Digital records became a central focus. Reports referenced online activity linked to the general area of Nancy Guthrie's residence in the months preceding her disappearance. These records were described as part of ongoing investigative review, with authorities analyzing access logs and search activity tied to relevant addresses. At the same time, federal involvement expanded. The FBI's participation introduced additional analytical tools, including cell tower mapping and device-level tracking designed to reconstruct movement patterns in the surrounding area during the critical time frame. Investigators were working to align physical timelines with digital signals. This included identifying which devices were active in the region during the early hours of February 1st and comparing that information with known movement patterns. Parallel to this, behavioral analysis units were reportedly reviewing the structure of the case to assess planning indicators and familiarity with the environment surrounding the victim's residence. No conclusions were publicly confirmed regarding identity or responsibility. Instead, the focus remained on constructing a comprehensive timeline supported by multiple layers of evidence. During this phase, media reporting continued to follow law enforcement activity closely. Brian Entin's coverage highlighted ongoing investigative presence at multiple locations, reinforcing the understanding that the case remained active and multi-layered. Authorities continued to refrain from releasing detailed interpretations of findings, emphasizing that the investigation was ongoing and that premature conclusions could interfere with evidentiary review. This period marked a shift from immediate response to structured analysis. Every piece of information being reviewed was measured against a single question. What changed in the hours after Nancy Guthrie was last seen entering her home? Despite extensive investigation, that question remained without a public answer. And as more data was collected, the complexity of the case increased rather than narrowed. The timeline remained intact in structure, but incomplete in explanation, which meant the final hours of January 31st and early February 1st continued to stand as the central unresolved segment of the investigation. And within that segment, investigators were still working to determine how movement, access, and communication intersected. At this stage, no definitive resolution had been reached. But the direction of the investigation was becoming clearer. It was moving toward convergence. And what that convergence would reveal was still ahead. As the investigation entered its later phase, federal and local agencies continued coordinating efforts to align physical evidence with digital and behavioral analysis. The FBI's involvement brought structured review of forensic material collected from key locations connected to the case. That included analysis of physical traces, communication records, and environmental data tied to the timeline of disappearance. Cell tower mapping played a significant role in reconstructing device activity in the Catalina foothills area during the early morning hours of February 1st. Investigators worked to identify patterns of movement and cross-reference them with known locations of interest. At the same time, behavioral analysis specialists reviewed the sequence of events leading up to the disappearance, focusing on timing consistency, access familiarity, and deviations from expected routine. Despite this layered approach, no final public conclusion had been issued regarding responsibility or cause. The case remained open. What had changed was the depth of analysis now being applied to the timeline. The final confirmed sighting of Nancy Guthrie at 9:50 p.m. remained the anchor point. Everything after that continued to be reconstructed through indirect evidence. Brian Entin's reporting remained focused on documenting visible law enforcement presence and updates as they became available through official and on-the-ground developments. However, investigators maintained caution in releasing detailed interpretations of findings. This restraint reflected the ongoing nature of the case and the need for confirmation before public disclosure. Within the family and broader public discussion, uncertainty continued to define the situation. The absence of a confirmed resolution left the timeline open-ended, with key questions still unanswered regarding the exact sequence of events inside the critical window. As the investigation continued, attention remained fixed on that narrow period of time in early February when all confirmed signals stopped. And despite extensive review, that gap in the timeline had not yet been fully explained. At this stage, the case stood at a point of unresolved convergence. Evidence had been collected. Analysis was ongoing. But a final determination had not been made public, which left one question still standing at the center of everything. What exactly happened after Nancy Guthrie entered her home on the night of January 31st? That answer remains the focus of continuing investigation. And as authorities work through the remaining evidence, the case continues to hold attention, not for what has been confirmed, but for what has not yet been explained. For viewers following this case, the next developments may bring clarity to the timeline that has remained fractured since that night. If you have thoughts on what stands out most in this sequence of events, share them in the comments. And subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on, because the next update in this investigation carries details that could shift the understanding of everything so far.